We talked about it earlier. This has been very organic all along.
We're definitely wanting to welcome Ellen and her parents, but one thing we do need to do is thank our sponsors, and that's the Jefferson County Library, the Adele and Sumner Rodriguez Fund of the Oregon Community Foundation.
And that's their picture.
Yeah, that a long time ago, I think.
Yeah.
And Mountain Graphics, photos and graphics,
And the graphic arts.
and our photo. Yes, but the graphic arts class at Memphis High School was definitely a bonus for us, and we appreciate Sue and Corley also, who gave up her art way for us. So we're very thankful for all of this. And for you for coming, so we can just let you meet us.
Thank you. I feel like I'm like among friends now. Everybody here, on some of you on multiple occasions. I'm Ellen Urbani. I go to Landfall. I actually want to introduce my parents because they may be the people in the crowd that the rest of you don't really know. This is Guy and Katie Urbani.
Hello.
And so many thanks to the kind sponsors who also got us a room with an extra bed. And my parents came along to get to know your community as well. So thank you for welcoming all of us. So, you know, like I said, I sort of see many of you at various events, and I try not to tell the stories too many times. I think poor Mary's like gonna, she's gonna be so happy to see me go and stuff.
You're digging up new stories that are great.
Yes, I keep trying to dig up new stuff so that I won't bore you all to tears. So what I will say is we won't talk about the end of the book. There's some twists and some turns. We're not going to do reveals so that if people haven't read the book that they won't be disappointed about knowing much more than they want to before they start reading it. But I'd like to talk about a little bit about kind of my motivations in writing the book. And I think when you take on any endeavor, right, there are maybe a dozen reasons why you do something, whether that's raising children or marrying a man or a woman. There's a lot of different reasons that bring you to that decision. And one that I haven't talked about is, as we've sort of skirted around various issues, I thought I'd share tonight. And my poor parents are going to be bored with my stories, but here we go. I went to college at the University of Alabama, which was a magnificently pleasurable place to go to school. The Crimson Tide, if you're not familiar with it, Roll Tide. There's the football team that has been winning every national championship in the past decade. But it's a great football school. It's a beautiful campus. And, I was born in Philadelphia. My parents, both their families are in that area and are still in that area. And we had moved, and I spent my youth in Virginia. But I wanted to go somewhere that I thought would be very different than the cultures that I had already experienced. And the Deep South seemed like kind of the way to be in a different world while still staying in the United States. And it very much did turn out to be that way. And I joined a sorority when I was a freshman. I went down early, I went through Rush. And Greek life at the University of Alabama is unlike anything you've really ever witnessed anywhere outside of the Deep South. We lived in magnificent mansions. And I was telling somebody last night that the flower budget for one of our parties was $10,000 during Rush. And that was just the flower portion of the budget, not the food or anything else.
Oh my goodness.
But what surprised me, what I wasn't aware of, you've heard the lore about the Deep South, but what I was not aware of was the degree to which segregation, discrimination, racism still existed in the South when I went to school at Alabama in 1987. So I went through Rush, I joined a sorority, and it wasn't until I was sort of in that I realized, everyone's white, right? There's no African Americans, there's no Hispanics, there's no anyone but white people in any of these fraternities or sororities. And I was sharing with the folks I had dinner with, anybody want to guess when the Greek system at the University of Alabama became integrated? It was not when I went to school there in 1987. Oh, you want to guess? Anybody?
2004.
2004. Nope.
Too high or too low?
Too low.
Too low. and that's the year that the Greek system became integrated at the University of Alabama. But the year I was there, 1987, it still was not. And the Greek system had, they had a voting block going on. It was called the Machine. It operated, it's sort of one of those ghost organizations that you hear about at various campuses. I think people are a little more familiar with, say, Skull and Crossbones up at Yale. The University of Alabama had a group, had and has a group called the Machine. And what that is each of the white fraternities and sororities choose, most of the members don't know, but one person is appointed a representative. They are tapped to be a representative for each of the white fraternities and sororities. They meet in secret and they decide who will be student body president, who will hold all of the elected offices on campus, and then that person goes back and tells the rest of the members how they're going to be voting in the upcoming election. Yeah, so voter fraud started at the University of Alabama. They had nothing on the University of Alabama, those Russians. So anyway, but oddly enough, one of the elected positions at the University of Alabama is homecoming queen. And there had been a series of white homecoming queens at the University of Alabama. And so the African American community decided as a collective that they really had just about enough of this. And I still to this day cannot quite fathom how it is that they managed to organize well enough to pull this off. But they collectively voted with the non-Greek students there, and they managed to vote into position a black homecoming queen in the autumn of 1987. Yes. And so I still, to this day, I remember the game. And, and again, I just had to set the stage for you. I went to Alabama. I really didn't know anyone there. I had joined the sorority, and it kind of became my place, right? My place in the world. And I started dating this boy, and his fraternity became my secondary place in this world of strangers. And so he was my date. At Alabama, you always go to a football game with a date. And wear a great big mom on your chest. And so we went full of pomp and circumstance to the game at the University of Alabama. And they brought the homecoming court out onto the field. It was a nationally televised game. At that time, the stadium held 60,000 people. And they announced the homecoming queen is Opal Butler. And the entire Greek student section stood. They put a level there, my goodness. And I think that he is playing with the volume
I can hear you better.
and disappeared. Is this okay? I feel like I can hear myself talking back to him.
Okay.
But if you're I think he turned it on and ran off for a beer. There he is! Anyway, so they announced Opal Butler's name as the homecoming queen, and the entire Greek section, 10,000 students, stood up, turned their back to her on the field, and
Wow.
And so here's the thing, is that I was so shocked. I had just never seen that level of hate, right? Or unkindness, of disrespect, of discrimination. I mean, I heard about it, but to actually be standing there when it occurs is a really almighty thing to witness. And I had jumped to my feet and stood with everybody else because I thought we were going to cheer for Opal Butler, and everyone around me turned their back to the field and began to boo. And I stood there, just stunned. Joe, I didn't know what to do, right? And I still, to this day, I remember how sick I suddenly felt. And everyone around me, there wasn't anyone left who wasn't behaving that way. And I just stood there. And I couldn't turn my back on her, and I couldn't boo her. But here's the thing, I just couldn't move. And I just stood there, and everyone finally stopped booing and turned around and sat down, and I sat down, and the game went on. And there are a lot of people, as I've told this story since Landfall came out, a lot of people who have said to me, well, it's okay, you didn't boo her. You didn't turn turn your back to her. You didn't do anything wrong. And I'm here to tell you that standing and doing nothing while someone is being hurt is not the equivalent of doing nothing wrong. You know, there's a Desmond Tutu quote, and he says, silence in the face of injustice. If you stand silent in the face of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And I can tell you how very true that feels. And I was scared, right? And I can explain it all. I was scared that these are my friends. These are like people I'm relying on. And also the other thing is, they genuinely were very good and nice people in lots of other ways. They loved their parents, they excelled at school, they volunteered at, the local animal shelter. In so many ways, they were good folk who were doing something really horrible. And I went home that night and thinking all of this through, vowed to myself that I could never do that again. And I don't even know what the right thing to have done in that circumstance was, but I can tell you that standing there and doing nothing was not the right thing. And I went home and I vowed to myself, I will never again be that person who stands still and does nothing when someone is being hurt. And you know what, but I also realized that I've actually been traveling much of the past 2 years to high schools and to middle schools talking about this aspect of this experience as we sort of look at the things that are going on in our country. And what I realized, and I'm so grateful for that insight, I realized that if you don't practice what you are going to do in the face of that kind of an experience, you simply are so shocked. You can't move. You're sort of paralyzed, right? And you can never fully anticipate what the experience is going to be, but I really practiced for years, what would I do if this? How would I react if that? And it was just a couple of years later that I really had the chance to sort of put this vow that I had made myself into practice. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I was living in Guatemala at the time. It was 1991, 92, and 93. So I was 22, 23, 24 years old. And the country was at the end of almost a quarter of a century of civil war. The war ended in Guatemala in 1996. So I was there sort of at the tail end of the Civil War. And there was tremendous violence and some horrible things that were happening. It was a very unsafe place to be at that time. But one of the things that was happening is that the government and the military was fighting against the indigenous people in the indigenous communities, the tribal communities, and massive genocides were taking place and huge immigration, people trying to get across the border into Mexico. And anyway, but after 20-some years of civil war, the military's ranks were dwindling significantly. And so they were engaging in some creative recruiting processes, which meant that they would drive these big caravans into some of the mountain villages, and they would kidnap all of the boys under the age of over the age of like 9 or so. And then they would kidnap them, they would conscript them into military service. If they did not participate, they would either kill the child or they would threaten to kill the child's family. And this is how they were building back up the army ranks of men and boys who were then sent out to fight against their own family members. And so I knew that this was happening in places, you hear about it, but one day I was in my little hut, my house, and there's this frantic banging on the door. And it was a woman I was friends with. Her name was Josefina. And she, if any of you have read my book, I changed the names in the book, so it'll be a different name for you. But Josefina was her name. And she was banging on my door, and I opened it up, and she said, Elena, they're coming. And you could sort of hear the engines sort of coming down the valley. She said, they're coming to take the children, they're coming to take the boys. And her husband had been killed. He had been one of what is called los desaparecidos, the disappeared ones in Guatemala. Those were the men who had risen up against the government and were taken in the night, never to be seen again. They were called los desaparecidos. Her husband was one of the disappeared. and she had 6 children. She was raising on her own by doing laundry for people and selling tamales on the street corner. And she had 2 sons who were of the age that they were coming for. And she said to me, will you take my children? Will you hide my children? And the thing was, Josefina had nowhere to hide her children. She lived in a lean-to next to a pigsty. She had no way to help her children herself. And essentially what she was saying to me was, will you do what I can't do for my children? Will you save my children? And so I took her children and I hid her sons in my home. And the military came through and they broke through every door and they searched every house. And the children stayed hidden, and we were safe. Do you want me to tell you how this happened? So I had sort of the house. This house was, I was renting this house, and it was sort of this big 1-room home. But there were these 2 rooms off to the side, one of which had a closed door, it was sealed with a padlock, and I was told I was never to go into this room. Well, tell me never to do something. My parents can attest, I'm sure. Anyway, I had found the key, and I had gone into this room previous to this, and the room was, essentially, it was serving as a storehouse. The Catholic Church had been damaged in an earthquake, and so they had clearly taken, the altar was in there, and a lot of the big statuary, the statue of Mary the Virgin and Christ on the cross, and they had clearly, they're using this room as a storeroom for all of the statuary and the altar from the Catholic Church. And so I took the boys and I grabbed the key and I opened this and I put them inside the altar, which, my only real hope was that they would not go into this room. And I pushed some of the statues in front of them, but they would have been seen. And I said to the boys, you have to trust me. Whatever happens, you must be quiet. You cannot make any noise no matter what, and I will take care of you. And I locked the door, and by the time I locked this padlock, I still had the key in my hand when they came through the door. And they searched the room, and they went over to this door, and the man in charge, they opened this door. And thank God, you draw on the few skills you have. I'm a good storyteller, and I tend to exaggerate a little bit every once in a while, which my friend thinks, what's this to? And anyways, they opened the door, and I said, I can't open the door. And they had guns to me, and they said, open the door. And I went and acted as if I was trying to find this key in a basket. And I said, but I can't. I said, I was told that there's a curse on this room. Because here's the thing, Guatemalans are nothing if not superstitious. They have that same sort of mix of kind of magical thinking and a bit of voodoo and shamanistic beliefs and Catholicism that you find in New Orleans. And I said, I can't open the door. I've heard that there's a curse on this room, and I had the key in my hand. And I said, I was told that the last person who opened that door died in childbirth the very same night, and the man who opened the door before she did choked on a chicken bone and died. And I said, and I can't open the door. And he said, open the door. And I held out the key, and I said, if you're braver than I am, you open the door. I said, but tell me if it's true. If you see the very face of Satan coming for you when you open it. And he took the key, and he unlocked the door, and he pushed it open. Well, the last thing I had done, as I heard these men coming and put the kids in that room, is there's this big statue of Satan, like Lucifer, the Lucifer character with the big, he looks like a gargoyle. And I had pulled the edge of it in line with the door. And as he pushed open that door, nothing in my life has ever worked as perfectly as it had to at that very moment. And he pushed open the door, and it caught the edge of that statue, and this satanic, life-size thing came flying out the door at the man. I said, you have never seen a group of armed men scream and evacuate a building faster than they left my house. And those children, bless them, were quiet through the whole thing. And they And the army came in multiple times after that to kidnap more children, and I said, no military man ever set a foot over my threshold again. I was able to hide dozens of kids in that house afterward. But I hid the kids. And so, but here's the thing, had I not been prepared to do the right thing under really difficult circumstances, I might have just frozen, right? That would have been a normal response. But I knew what I could and could not live with myself doing, because I had failed Opal Butler. And I've so often thought back to that time with that girl, and you sort of think through what could I have done instead of stand there with these people who are treating her so horribly, like what if I had, what if I had been willing to cheer? What if, would somebody else have stopped and done what I did? Sometimes you just need somebody to lead you in the right direction. And so, I never got to do that for Opal Butler. I never got to make up for failing her that day. But I feel like in some ways, I've made penance, right? There are 2 children who are alive in many ways because of Opal Butler, because of the lessons I learned from her. And in some ways, then, the writing of this book is a similar way to atone for the way I failed that young black girl that day. And, in the wake of this storm, I think so many of our African-American friends and neighbors were failed by us. They were left to rot on rooftops. They were held culpable for failing to leave their homes in the face of a storm that they thought would they be safer staying inside. We failed that community in so many ways, and in my small little corner of the world, this is the way I pay Opal back for what I failed to do for her. I have tried to do for some of her community members. And there's a sentence in this book where it talks about when Sela, the mother, had run away at one point, and she left her community, and no one looked for her. And it's Rose thinking about going to try and find who Rosie is and let her family know. And there's this reference to this idea that if she didn't do that, Rosie would simply become another missing black girl in a South that is full of them. And that was the piece that belongs to her. That's one element of why I wrote it. So we can talk more about race. We can talk more about the book specifically. I know I've got a couple of questions for you all. I also don't need to just chatter on myself. Does anybody have a question that you didn't write down that you'd like to talk about? Something you'd like to ask or discuss?
This isn't really a question, but when Katrina happened, I was watching it on TV, and of course, for us, people were sending what we could, contributing money and doing all that. But it really surprised me how thin the veneer of civilization is when something happens. It just was gone. There was no civilization there for weeks.
Right.
And it was just a surprise. I think our little civilized world is very thin.
It really is, and we were having a bit of this discussion at the teen book group at the library yesterday. Mm-hmm. But I was saying, there's actually, there's the whole psychological field of trauma and reactions to kind of breakdown of society, right? And how they've been able to track that when people are removed from what they know and experience a horrific trauma and their circumstances become traumatizing, that within 4 days, many people will lose the capacity to believe it will ever return to normal. It's actually there's an alteration in the way your brain stores memory and responds to circumstance that is very pronounced. And actually some of that research has led, for instance, The military uses this in part of their training with some of the soldiers in wartime conditions to train them how to, like, things to do mentally to keep from kind of crossing that line if you say you're taken hostage. But I think we saw that happen quite a bit in the wake of Katrina, where, because when the water came into that city, New Orleans sits below sea level. On average, 8 feet below sea level, though there are certain parts of the city that are as far as 21 feet below sea level. And of course, the Mississippi River flows alongside, and then there's a large lake to the north of New Orleans. And when the levees broke, both the lake and the river flowed into the city. But unlike, for instance, the tsunami in Thailand, where this massive wave of water comes in and it wreaks havoc, but then it recedes pretty quickly. The flood of New Orleans was unique in that when the levees broke and the water came in, of course we got the water level here, we got the city down here, and the water flowed in, but the Mississippi keeps flowing, right? And so water is continuing to pour into the city. It took 3 days before the water rose high enough in the city to equalize with the lake and the river and stop rising. So that initial flood, it wasn't an initial flood, it went on for 3 days. And anyone who was trapped wound up getting above the water line. But it's not like they carried food up from their kitchen with them as they ran from essentially what was a 3-story tsunami coming into their neighborhood. They simply evacuated up and continued to keep going up through, say, the roof or the ceiling in the attics onto the roof. No food, no water. Most families were separated in one way or another. Either they were not in the same place when it hit, or certain family members could not survive the circumstances. I was, sharing a story earlier today at the library in Warm Springs about a true, and I based the characters on true events, and it was a father and a man and his adult son and that son's 4 children. So it was 3 generations, a grandfather, a father, and 4 children who climbed into an attic. They wound up going through the roof, and then it was continued to rise, and none of them could swim. And so the water was continuing to come up, and they realized that from their roof, they were going to drown. And the neighbor had a 1-story higher house, and there was a tree that had fallen, and the grandfather climbed across the tree onto the next roof, but the water kept flowing, and it knocked the tree away. So you have the father and his 4 children on one roof, and the grandfather on the other roof. And they wound up, the father took his children one by one and swung them and threw them across the gap to the grandfather on this other roof. And they saved 2 of the 4 children that way, and the other 2 children landed in the water and were not. And so, so imagine that circumstance. The father himself is still on this roof. The grandfather now has the 2 grandchildren on that roof. 2 of them are dead by the father's own actions. 3 days with no food, no water. They're lifted off finally in helicopter and by boat, so they're all taken to different locations. And they're separated, right? There were massive numbers of families where, like, one would be lifted by the helicopter and dropped on an overpass over here, where they then started evacuating people onto an airstrip where they took them directly to Houston. This one gets picked up by the fishing boat, who takes them to the Superdome, where they manage to walk out across the Crescent City Connection Bridge eventually, and then they get taken and put in a shelter in Mississippi, right? So the families are separated. All lines of communication are down all along the coast. No cell phones work, no landlines operated. There were families who remained separated for months because they couldn't find each other. And they didn't know where to come home to. So it's not like you can turn around and all meet back at the house, right? They were separated for months. So imagine someone living through that kind of a trauma, and the way in which it alters your capacity to think that life will ever be normal again. And some of the breakdown that we saw in societal norms, right, in New Orleans, was an after effect of the fact that all of these people were left in these circumstances that they could not see into. And we do uncharacteristic things in those moments. You kind of desperately do what you need to survive. I was saying there's another book by an author named Sherry Fink. Sherry is an MD who also is a journalist, and she's a magnificent writer. And her book is, she wrote a book about an incident after Katrina called 5 Days at Memorial. It won the Pulitzer Prize. A magnificent book. But it talks about Memorial Hospital, where evacuation orders came in on the 4th day that they had to evacuate the hospital. They'd been stranded. The generators had stopped working by the morning of the 2nd day. They had run out of food. They were keeping like heart-lung machines going by hand because there was no electricity. They were trying to evacuate people on a hole in the wall and then carry them up a series of staircases to offload patients one by one onto Coast Guard helicopters when they came by. They were sending others out in boats. Anyway, on the 5th day at Memorial was the day that the government said, we will no longer be sending any resources to this building. Everyone must be out. And a roving band of nurses and one doctor went through the remaining patients and allegedly euthanized all of them who could not make the last votes out of the building. But again, so there have been, it turned into a very significant, it had very significant repercussions, as you can imagine. But and the doctor and the nurses were widely condemned, as you might understand. Because there were, in some cases, there were patients who were sitting up and talking. And yet, there's also been a certain degree of compassion for this idea that all indicators seem to point to the fact that they truly believe they were doing they were performing a compassionate act under circumstances that they believed were irrevocably altered. And it was the 5th day, right? And so, by that 4th day, it seems that a lot of people trapped in those circumstances simply believed that they were never going to live anymore, like exist under normal circumstances. And it all So there are the horrible stories. But there are, you can't you can't write an authentic story about an experience of massive trauma without there being really desperate and despairing stories. And yet I didn't want it to be a desperate and a despairing book. In many ways, I actually believe that even the choices we make that are wrong, that you can sort of morally say that it was a morally wrong thing to do, can seem right at the time, and sometimes seem perhaps are necessary. There's a scene in the book where the young girl is trying to save her mother, and they're on a roof, and the mother is drowning, and she has to choose who is she going to help. She is going to have to let someone die in order to save someone else. She can't save both. And the person she can't save cannot hang on to them, or everyone will die. And it's sort of a selfish choice. If you've read that book, which I think is a magnificent piece of literature, where sometimes we do, with the best of intentions, we do things that are awfully wrong, right? But I believe, essentially, that we are all, each of us, better than our worst moment, right? And so I tried to explore in this book this idea of people with good intentions doing the wrong thing. And yet, how do we redeem ourselves? And again, I've been sharing that story about Opal Butler. I have been there. I understand that. And I understand the weight of it on you as a person. But how do we take our worst moments, some of our biggest mistakes? Do we let them consume us? Do we let them turn us into a different person? Or do we use them to alter our life? Do we learn from them, right? And my hope is that this book is a book that in the end actually is hopeful. That it takes people in desperate circumstances and demonstrates how they find what is best inside of them. And in my career as an oncology counselor previous to that, it was the same way. So many people used to say to me, oh my God, isn't this depressing? You work with people who are dying every day. And I did. And yet, at their most desperate moments, I saw the most magnificent stuff come out of people. The most beautiful things happen. Right at the moment you might think somebody would be consumed by what is worst in them. And so I hope that that shines through in this book.
A word that that keeps coming up for me, and I think you used the word belonging. That Rose wants so desperately for Rosie to belong somewhere. I mean, that she has got to belong to somebody, and that really stuck out for me. And I don't know if you could talk about that. And, I think that was a really important theme for me in the book. The whole sense of belonging and searching for, connecting the dots.
And sort of searching for your place in the world.
Right.
Like that everybody, I think, and it may be a little bit reflective again of kind of my own world and life. And I think you put so much of yourself into anything you create. I was saying to somebody, like, if I came to your home and, I would know something about you just by looking around at the way you crafted your own space. And so there's a lot of me in this book. And I think I've spent a lot of time in my life wanting to do things myself, like wanting to prove I could do something myself, like craving this level of independence and coming to learn that like we're not disconnected from each other, right? We need each other, and we need a place to be and a place to belong. I spent a lot of time sort of running toward new experiences, toward new places, and then there were times when I needed to come home. And that to me is a very universal concept. And I think when you're writing a book about an experience like of living through a hurricane like Katrina, none of us had lived through Hurricane Katrina. But what are the pieces of those people's stories that we can connect with, right? What are those things we have in common? And I think that those are the things we most need to find in literature or in theater or in the arts, in our conversations with each other. Where are the places we're connected versus the things that disconnect us? And I think we're, again, seeing that play out on a national level right now, this idea that, you're on that side and I'm on this team and, ne'er shall our paths ever meet. And the bottom line is like, we have a lot more in common than we don't. Right? And I think in times like of disasters, when we actually truly need each other, it's those differences sort of melt away. And I wanted to look at the way in which Rose could find a place for Rosie to belong, even if it wasn't Rosie's place. Right? And I hope that allows people to feel like they can connect with those characters, even when we have perhaps not that much in common. Like, say, a 19-year-old girl who lived through a hurricane or died in the wake of a hurricane. So. You are very popular. I can't tell you how many times my own phone has begun ringing as I'm sitting up here talking. Yeah. So, anybody else have something you want to ask, discuss? I'm going to pull out some of these questions. Bear with me.
So while I'm looking for those, I just wanted to say that, nobody knows how to react in that situation, but so much goodness comes out of a lot of that tragedy, and people do reach out with compassion and humanity. And our son was in Houston, and their hurricane was going on, and that they were so moved by the flotillas or whatever they were called, the people coming from New Orleans and help people in Houston.
Yeah, they come with the boat.
Something, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it just brought tears to my eyes, and they had been through this crap, and Houston recovered a lot quicker because it's a totally different, and they're not totally recovered. I'm not saying that, but obviously not below sea level and
Right.
In a wealthier area. But yeah, I just wanted to share that because so much goodness does come out of suffering.
It really does seem that way, doesn't it? It's, I was reading an essay today in Warm Springs about the incident in Portland on the MAX train where the 3 men had tried to intervene when the 2 girls were being harassed, and two of them were murdered. And my daughter and her friend and I had an experience with someone shortly thereafter where we were chased by someone of similar mindset to Jeremy Christian, who murdered those men on the Max train. We were at a march, and anyway, and it was sort of wrestling with this. And I was at the service for the men who died and met Mike, the man who survived, and the families of the two fallen men, and kind of wrestling with how do you respond in the face of that? And the imam at this service, it was a multi-faith service, was saying, like, we have to find a way to ask the angry man, are you okay? Like, how do we find our compassion for someone else? And this sense that even when you come up against such awfulness, such hatred, such sadness, right? That like the balance, the scales still tip toward good. They still tip toward good among most people. And in a way, that's what we need to rely on. And you see it come out all the time in circumstances like that. The firefighters rushing up the stairs in the Twin Towers, knowing exactly, not knowing exactly what was going to happen, but knowing what they might be rushing toward. And yet they went up the stairs and came down. The flotillas that they're talking about, the flotillas in Houston, and those were the fishermen from New Orleans who had also been involved in saving the African Americans. So the white fishermen who manned their boats for days on end, left their own families in order to save the black neighbors that under other circumstances, they were probably highly involved in isolating in those communities. And it's sad sometimes to think that it takes tragedy to bring out what is best in someone. But we see it.
There's a sad post she got stabbing them. The settlement money that came out. That now they're fighting over who should get more. Just saying that because you died, you should get more money than the other two. And the one young man that really helped save them said, well, I'm going to donate my money for a cause. And so the gift comes out and all of a sudden it's just...
It does. I'm not going to be Pollyanna about it.
That was sad because, it was all, I lived in Fort with all the newspapers, and then the final thing I saw was a parking up of money, and I'm thinking, how sad. So party over money. Anyway, it was nice sad.
Somebody back here has a question?
Yes, you.
I'm in the energy business, and there's a building material called autoclave aerated concrete, which is extremely strong for earthquakes and wind. And I learned after Katrina that there was a man who built a house where he had a view of the ocean out of this material. And it blew the windows out of the house, but the house stood. And when he got to his house, he cried because all of his neighbors were gone. His house was there, but that wasn't the whole deal. So,
A couple years ago, my husband and I traveled with another daughter of ours and her husband. And we went to France and Slovenia and Croatia. And my son-in-law said, Kate, I'm going to take you one night into Bosnia. And I'm going to take you to dinner. And so we went into Bosnia, but as we were driving through Bosnia, with the civil war that had happened there, the buildings, the stone homes were still, rubble. And other houses had big bullet holes in them. I had never seen anything like, none of us had. And we went into this little town, Bijan, and it was a college town, but it was a very small town, and there were these young men. And so my husband and our son-in-law went out, and they went over to them, and they spoke English. And we're Christian. My son-in-law is a Jew. But I would have loved to have visited a mosque. So they asked, we're only here for a couple hours. We would like to taste local food and we would also like to visit the mosque. And so he pointed out the street, he said, that's a mosque. And so anyway, we went up and we went into the vestibule. My son-in-law took off his shoes. There was an imam sitting far into the church. And he walked in, and we had an hour that this man spoke to us. And he was saying, look at us. He said, you are a Jew, you're a Christian, and I'm a Muslim. Look at all that we have in common with one another. He said, when the war took place, he said, I was a warrior. That's what they call them, soldiers. He said, we all in this town killed each other. So now the war is over. How do we come together as a community and try and live together and help each other? And he said, we just have to talk about our sameness and not our differences. And he said, that's the best we can do, like us right now. He said, we're all coming from a different place, but we are human and we have love and we just want to know about each other. And but that was such an experience for us. We've never been in a war-torn area where you actually that whole trip, we saw World War I, we were in Normandy, and, it was really a very war experience trip. It was a wonderful trip, but for some reason, of course, going to Normandy, we were having to experience that. But that night we spent in Bosnia was just very moving. And then when we were in Croatia, we had a Rick Steve's tour guide. And he had made the appointment ahead of time, and she met us. And we were the only ones, so it was the four of us and her. It was great. And she was talking about Tito and being under communist regime and now. And so, she told us about the area and whatever, and what the streets and so then I finally said, what do you feel? How did you feel living under a communist regime? How do you feel now? And she said, personally, when we were under the communists, everybody was taken care of. The old people were given homes, they had adequate money to eat, they were taken care of, they had medical care. She said now, and there was great respect for them. Now, in our towns, the older people they don't have adequate food, they don't have adequate medical. So she said in the town that we were in, she said there's probably about 50-50 people who preferred it under communists and people who preferred it the way it was now. But anyway, all of those things were really just people. We're really just people. And we all have the same needs, the same basic needs. And it was really a very moving experience. And when you hear all I'm talking about, as I've heard before, it's a wonderful thing if we could just see people as people.
Yeah, and it calls out one of the questions here that came in, and I think I've hit some of the other ones where it was asking about how my experience in the South influenced the book, discuss issues of race. But this last question says, did the MLK quote at the beginning of the book drive the book, or did you find the quote after writing the book? I want to read the quote to you because I think it very handily summarizes in some ways the discussion we wound up having tonight. The quote is, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope."
Can I? Yes, I'm so sorry. I have one thing here.
You want me to read a little louder?
One more time.
Absolutely. So we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. And it turns out this is the quote that is carved on the statue of Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C. at the MLK Monument, one of the newer monuments on the National Mall. That was the theme that drove the book. the quote I found somewhere in there as I was in the process of writing. I found this, and it just matched very perfectly. And I think it's one that I hang on to, right? We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. We are more alike than we are different. We are caught in a single garment of destiny, right? We're all moving together in the same direction. We are better off if we are working together as we go forward than if we fight with each other as we advance, right? Which actually brings me to the way I think we're going to sum up the evening together, because I have so loved getting to know the folks here in your community, and it's been really fascinating to kind of find out who came from where, or who kind of lived here their whole lives, and what drew you here. And so Ray and Annette here were sharing a story with me this morning of how they came together as a couple. And they dated as teenagers, like young teenagers. Yeah. Well, he was her counselor. It's a sordid tale.
Anila, back there, the lady that she and her husband donated this building, she was my 4-H leader back in
Wow.
grade school.
Okay, so she was the 4-H leader. He was the 4-H camp counselor. And then they went their separate ways, had big separate lives, and came together again a couple of years ago, and are now a couple. And they were telling me one of the ways that they came together was Ray is a singer, and Annette had always wanted to kind of conquer her fear of singing, and it's something that they do together. And I asked them if they would come tonight and sing for us. And so they agreed to do it. And we were saying, it's so much more fun for me if we can get the whole about communities coming together, right? And so we were trying to come up with this idea of what song the rest of you might know, so that I could force all of you to sing. I'll sing Entice. Okay, there we go. So, then I turn it over to Ray and Annette.
It's a good song.
And she picked it, and she said, I'm going to
I'm going to have you sing. Sir, I think you need to turn down my mic. Bring it up now.
Turn it up, turn it on. And
No, I'm going to sing loud. I don't want to cause anyone any pain. Is the
This land is your land.
I can do that.
So she said to me at Coffee Covers this morning, she said, "Oh, I like your hat." And I had a black cowboy hat on, but when she said the song was "This Land Is Your Land" or Woody Guthrie, I thought I'd get a Woody Guthrie type hat.
You have that.
This particular hat has a story because it's Annette's grandfather's hat.
Yes.
So he probably sometime when he was wearing this saw a picture of Woody Guthrie when Woody Guthrie was alive.
Yeah.
And Ray got this for you to shake along with us. And we've got 2 mics, you've got to come up here and join us.
Okay.
But two
I mean,
stand so we can see it.
And then we're hoping when the chorus comes around, you guys will sing with us.
And if you know the words without the chorus, Mom,
Yeah, jump in.
start singing. Come up here and sing with me. Here, you just sing the whole thing. Mom, you Mom, that one. The one that belongs to me. Yeah. My Mom. Come up and sing.
Vicky knows every song. She needs to reference. I'm gonna. Last week, I was the song leader. I'm gonna make dance.
Okay, here we go.
You gotta
You'll find it, we'll wait.
He's making me, he's encouraging me. I'm too shy to use a pick because I think it's too loud. And I actually think I put it in here, but I can't find it.
Well, I hope you did.
While she's looking for that, I want to tell you a story that everybody here can play a guitar, even if you've never played one. I have taken this guitar and tuned it to something called open D, which means that without putting my fingers on the strings, this is the D chord.
Whereas listen if I could without pressing anything down.
Isn't that weird?
Yes.
So that means that all I have to do is put a straight line across here,
I got a chord.
Oh.
So, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah,